The stone cracked before anyone screamed. Elira Vance felt it under her palms before she heard it, a shudder running through the old gate like something waking up after 100 years of sleep. She had only meant to walk past it on her way home from the market, the way she did every evening, past the crumbling arch at the edge of Ashwick Hollow that nobody in the village dared to touch. But a boy named Finn had thrown a stone at it on a dare, laughing, not knowing what he was doing, and the moment the stone struck the old seal carved into the arch, a thin black crack opened down the center of it like a wound. The air around the gate turned cold in an instant. Not autumn cold, not evening cold. A cold that smelled faintly of rot and old smoke. A cold that made the hair on Elira's arms stand up, and made every bird in the trees around the hollow go silent at once. Finn dropped the second stone he had been holding and stumbled back, his face white. "I didn't mean it," he said, over and over. But nobody was listening to him anymore, because the crack in the gate was widening, and behind it, past the thin dark line in the stone, something was pressing forward, something old, something that had been waiting. Elira didn't decide to move. Her body simply moved for her, the way it sometimes did when there was no time to think, only to act. She threw herself against the gate, and pressed both palms flat to the stone, right over the widening crack, and pushed with everything she had. The moment her skin touched the stone, the whole gate went still. For one heartbeat, Elira thought she had stopped it. Relief rushed through her, sharp and dizzying. Then she felt something else, something worse. A pulling sensation, deep under her palms, as if the stone itself was reaching up through her hands and wrapping around her wrists, her arms, her chest, binding itself to her the way ivy binds itself to a wall. She tried to pull her hands away. They would not move. "Someone help me," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "My hands won't come off the gate." The villagers who had gathered began to back away instead of coming closer. She understood why. Everyone in Ashwick Hollow had grown up hearing the old story about the sealed gate at the edge of the woods, the one that was supposed to hold back whatever had swallowed an entire pack of wolves 100 years ago. Nobody in living memory had ever seen it crack open. Nobody knew what waited on the other side, only that the old wards had been strong enough to keep it there for a century, and that the elders always warned the children never to throw stones at old things they didn't understand. An older woman named Dara, who kept the village's small apothecary, was the first to find her courage. She hurried forward, her shawl slipping off one shoulder, and reached out to touch Elira's wrist. The second her fingers brushed Elira's skin, she flinched back with a hiss, shaking her hand, as if it had been burned. "It's cold," Dara said, staring at her own fingers. "Colder than anything living should be." "Elira, can you feel your fingers?" "I can feel everything," Elira said through her teeth. Her palms had begun to ache, a deep throb that traveled up into her wrists, and beneath that ache was something stranger, a pulling sensation, like the stone was trying to draw something out of her, layer by layer. "It's like it wants something from me. It's pulling." "Don't let go," Dara said quickly, gripping her own hands together, as if to stop herself from reaching out again. "Whatever you do, don't take your hands off that gate." "I'm not doing this on purpose," Elira snapped, panic sharpening her voice. "I can't move them. They won't move." By now, more villagers had gathered at a careful distance, drawn by the noise and the strange cold rolling off the old arch. Whispers passed between them, quiet and frightened. A young man ran to fetch the village elder, an old man named Bram who had lived in Ashwick Hollow longer than anyone could remember, and who was the only one who still kept the older books, the ones written before the gate was sealed. Elira stood with her back to the crowd, and her front pressed against ancient stone, her heart slamming against her ribs. She could feel the crack beneath her palms, a thin seam of pure cold, and every few moments it seemed to pulse, like something breathing on the other side, testing the barrier, testing her. "It's still trying to open," she said, mostly to herself. "I can feel it pushing." "Then you're holding it," Dara said, some steadiness returning to her voice now, the calm of someone used to handling emergencies even when she didn't understand them. "You're holding it shut, Elira. However you did it, don't stop." Elira laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "I don't know how I'm doing it. I didn't ask for this." "None of us ever ask for the things that end up saving everyone," Dara said quietly. The elder arrived a few minutes later, walking with the help of a wooden cane, his face drawn tight with worry the moment he saw the crack running down the gate and the young woman standing pinned against it. He didn't waste time with questions. He circled around her carefully, studying the crack, the frost gathering along its edges, the way her palms had begun to take on a faint blue tint from the cold radiating out of the stone. "This is the hollow curse," he said finally, his voice low. "I never thought I would see this crack open in my lifetime." "What is it?" Elira asked. Her arms had begun to shake from holding the same position for so long, though something about the way the stone gripped her hands seemed to be helping her stay upright, as if it did not intend to let her collapse. "A punishment," Bram said. "Sealed here 100 years ago, after it took an entire pack of wolves who lived in these woods. Nobody living remembers exactly what it is, only what the old records call it. The stories say it hungers for what it lost. If it gets free, it will not stop with the hollow."
"Then we have to close it properly," Dara said.
"Not just hold it, close it. The wards that sealed it were made with old magic. None of us have anymore," Bram said. "Magic strong enough to bind something that size. We are farmers and healers, not ward keepers." He looked at Elira with something between apology and dread. "We need help stronger than what this village has." "How long can I hold it?" Elira asked, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "Because I don't feel like I have a choice right now." Nobody answered her right away, and that silence told her more than any words could have. Word spread through the hollow faster than Elira could have imagined. Within the hour, every household in the village knew that something in the ground had cracked open at the edge of the woods, and that Dara's young neighbor, the quiet girl who helped brew tonics and gather herbs, was somehow the only thing keeping it shut. Some people came to see for themselves, standing at a careful distance, murmuring prayers under their breath. Others refused to come near at all, locking their doors early and keeping their children inside. Elira barely noticed the crowd anymore. The cold had settled into her bones, and the strange pulling sensation beneath her palms had grown sharper, more insistent, like fingers testing a locked door. Her legs had begun to ache from standing so long in one position, and thirst scratched at the back of her throat. But every time she thought about resting, about even shifting her weight, the crack beneath her hands widened by the smallest fraction, and a fresh wave of that awful cold rolled out toward the gathered villagers, driving them back with gasps. "Don't move," Dara said sharply, the first time it happened. "Elira, don't move at all. Whatever you feel, however tired you get, you cannot let go." "I'm trying," Elira whispered. Sweat had broken out across her forehead despite the cold, her body caught in some strange battle between exhaustion and the force holding her upright. "I don't know how long I can do this." Bram sent 2 riders out that same evening, one toward the nearest town and one much farther, toward the capital of the United Packs, where the Alpha King ruled over every pack and territory in the land. It was a desperate decision, the elder admitted quietly to Dara, as they watched the second rider vanish down the road into the dark. The Alpha King was not known for concerning himself with small villages like Ashwick Hollow, but if the old records were right about what slept behind that gate, then this was no longer a small village problem. "If he comes," Bram said, "he may be the only one with power enough to close it properly. If he doesn't..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Night fell hard and cold over the hollow. Elira remained at the gate, her arms trembling, her breath fogging in front of her face, even though the air away from the crack was still mild with early autumn warmth. Someone brought her a blanket and draped it carefully over her shoulders, careful not to touch her hands. Someone else brought water and held the cup to her lips so she could drink without moving her arms. She had never in her life imagined herself standing at the edge of the woods in the dark, pinned to a cursed gate, by forces she didn't understand, holding back something that had swallowed an entire pack 100 years ago. She had spent her whole life as an ordinary girl, in an ordinary village, helping her mother's old friend mix tonics and gather herbs, dreaming of nothing more exciting than a quiet, simple life. Now her palms were bound to ancient stone, and somewhere out on a dark road, a rider was carrying word of her to the most powerful man in the land, and she had no idea whether he would come, or whether she would still be standing here when he did. The crack pulsed again beneath her hands, cold and hungry, and Elira closed her eyes and pressed harder, because there was nothing else left to do but hold on. By the second hour past midnight, the whispers among the villagers had grown into something closer to dread. Ashwick Hollow was a small place, the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business, where nothing more dramatic than a bad harvest or a sick cow usually happened. Nobody there had ever faced anything like the crack in the old gate, and nobody quite knew what to do with the fact that their peace now depended on one exhausted young woman's ability to keep standing. Dara stayed at Alira's side through the night, refusing every suggestion that she go home and rest. She checked Alira's pulse every so often, pressing 2 fingers gently to the inside of her wrist, without disturbing her hands on the stone, murmuring reassurances that Alira suspected were meant as much for Dara herself as for her. "You're still steady," Dara said quietly, somewhere near the 3rd hour of the night. "Your heartbeat's strong. That's good. That's very good. Doesn't feel good," Alira mumbled. Her voice had gone hoarse, her throat raw from the cold air she'd been breathing for hours. "Feels like my arms are going to fall off." "They won't," Dara said, with more confidence than she probably felt. "Whatever's holding you there is keeping you upright too. I've been watching. You haven't swayed once. Not really. Not even when you're clearly exhausted enough to collapse." "Small comfort," Alira said, managing a weak, tired laugh despite everything. Dara smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair away from Alira's damp forehead. "You're the bravest fool I've ever met, you know that? Most people would have run the moment that gate cracked." "I didn't have time to be brave," Alira admitted. "I just moved." "That's what bravery usually is," Dara said. "The moving, before the fear catches up." Around them, the village slowly quieted as exhausted watchers drifted home to rest, though a few stubborn souls stayed near the edges of the clearing, wrapped in blankets, keeping a distant vigil. The cold radiating from the gate never fully faded, and every so often it would surge, and the whole crowd would go silent, waiting to see whether the crack would widen further. It never did. Alira held. Near dawn, Bram returned to check on her, his old face lined with worry beneath the pale morning light. He studied the crack carefully, running one trembling hand just above the stone without touching it, murmuring something under his breath in a language Alira didn't recognize. "The wards are still there," he said finally, more to himself than to her. "Weakened, but there. You're not just blocking the crack, child. Somehow you're feeding what's left of the old seal. I don't know how. I don't know why it chose you. But it has, and for now, that is the only reason we are all still safe." "How long until the rider reaches the capital?" Alira asked. 2 days, if the horse doesn't tire," Bram said. "Perhaps less, if the king's own scouts intercept him sooner. The Alpha King's reach is long. Word may travel faster than we expect." "And if he doesn't come?" Bram was quiet for a long moment, watching the pale light strengthen over the tree line. "Then we will pray. Whatever is holding you here has more strength in it than any of us understand," he said, "and we will hope it is enough." Alira looked down at her pale, aching hands pressed flat against the cursed stone, frost clinging faintly to her fingertips, and tried not to think about how long 2 days could feel when every single hour already felt like an eternity. The cold pulsed against her palms once more, patient and hungry, as if it, too, understood exactly how long she would have to wait. She had no way of knowing. Standing there in the gray light of that first morning, that far away in the capital, a rider was already galloping through the palace gates with news that would reach the ears of the Alpha King himself before the sun had fully risen, and that within 2 days, the most powerful man in the land would stand before her at that very gate, staring at an ordinary village girl who was somehow doing what even his own strongest ward keepers might not have been able to do. For now, all Alira could do was breathe, and hold, and wait. The second day began the way the first had ended, with cold stone under her palms, and the weight of an entire village's fear pressing down on her shoulders. Alira had not slept, though her body kept slipping into strange half-moments of drifting, where her mind wandered even as her hands stayed locked in place. She would blink and realize an hour had passed without her noticing, the sun climbing higher, the shadows of the trees shifting across the clearing, and somehow, her feet had never moved, and her palms had never left the stone. Her arms had gone past aching into something duller, a kind of numbness that frightened her more than the pain had. Dara noticed it too, crouching in front of her with a worried crease between her brows, pressing warm cloths gently to the back of Alira's neck to keep her from shivering apart. "Talk to me," Dara said. "Tell me anything. I need to know your mind is still sharp." "My mind is fine," Alira said, though her voice came out thinner than she wanted. It's my legs I'm worried about. You haven't buckled once, Dara reminded her. Not once in a full day and night. Whatever is holding you to that gate isn't just draining you. I think it's also keeping you standing. Comforting, Alira murmured. Except that means I can't test what happens if it decides to stop. Dara didn't have an answer for that, and they both fell into an uneasy silence, listening to the wind move through the trees and the low murmur of villagers keeping their distant watch. By mid-morning, word came that the second rider, the one sent toward the capital, had reached a relay post along the King's Road far sooner than expected, and that the message had already been passed onward by a fast courier. Bram delivered the news himself, his relief obvious, even through his exhaustion. If the courier reaches the palace by tonight, he said, and if the king chooses to act quickly, he could be here by tomorrow evening. Perhaps sooner, if he travels with his fastest riders. Perhaps, Alira repeated. The word felt fragile in her mouth. And if he doesn't choose to act quickly? Bram didn't answer. And that silence had become an answer of its own kind over the past day. The thing none of them wanted to say aloud. Alira closed her eyes and focused on breathing, on keeping her palms flat, on ignoring the way her body screamed for rest. Word of what waited behind the gate had begun to change shape as it passed from person to person through the hollow, the way stories always do when fear gets involved. By afternoon, some of the younger villagers were whispering that the thing behind the crack was not simply an old curse, but something with a mind, something that had been listening to every conversation held near the gate, learning the names of the people who stood watch. Alira didn't know if that was true. She only knew that every so often, beneath her palms, she felt something that was not quite a pulse and not quite a voice, a pressure that came and went like breathing, patient in a way that unsettled her more than any sudden violence could have. It's not trying to break through anymore, she said quietly to Dara, sometime past midday, when the two of them were alone at the gate, while the rest of the village kept its distance. Not the way it was yesterday. It feels like it's waiting now. Waiting for what? Dara asked. I don't know, Alira admitted, but it feels patient, like it knows something we don't. Dara studied the crack for a long moment, her healer's instincts clearly turning the thought over. Perhaps it's testing you, she said finally, trying to understand what kind of person is holding it back. Perhaps it thinks if it waits long enough, you'll simply run out of strength on your own, and it won't need to force anything at all. The thought settled over Alira like another layer of cold. Then I suppose I'll have to prove it wrong, she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. The hours crawled forward. Villagers came and went throughout the day, some bringing food that Dara fed to Alira in small bites, since her hands could not leave the stone. Others simply standing at a distance, watching in a kind of hushed reverence that made Alira deeply uncomfortable. She had never asked to be anyone's hope. She had only reacted the way anyone might have reacted, throwing herself toward danger without thinking, because there had been no time to think. Now she was becoming something else in the eyes of the village, a symbol instead of a person, and the weight of that transformation felt almost as heavy as the curse itself. By evening, exhaustion had settled so deeply into her body that she began to lose track of time in longer stretches, drifting through moments of gray half-consciousness, where the edges of the world blurred and sharpened without warning. She was distantly aware of Dara's voice, steady and low, talking to her about nothing important, about the weather, about a batch of tonic that had gone wrong last spring, about anything at all that might keep Alira tethered to the present moment. Stay with me, Dara said, more than once. Alira, stay with me. Look at me. I'm here, Alira murmured each time, forcing her eyes open, forcing her voice steady. I'm still here. Night fell again, colder than the first, and this time the crowd that gathered near the clearing was smaller, most of the villagers too frightened or too exhausted themselves to keep vigil, a second night in a row. Bram stayed, along with Dara and a handful of the village's older, steadier residents. But even they had begun to speak in hushed, worried tones about what would happen if the king's help did not arrive in time. She cannot hold much longer, Alira heard someone say, someone who thought she was too far gone to hear them. Look at her, she's barely standing. She is standing, Dara said sharply, cutting through the murmur. And she will keep standing, because she has to, because we all have to. Alira wanted to laugh at that, at the fierce loyalty in Dara's voice, but she didn't have the strength left to do more than manage a faint, grateful smile that nobody could see in the dark. Sometime in the deepest hours of that second night, something changed beneath her palms. The pressure that had felt patient all day suddenly sharpened, gathering itself the way a held breath gathers before release, and Alira felt a fresh wave of cold roll outward from the crack, sharper and colder than anything she had felt since the gate first opened. "Something's happening," she gasped, her whole body going rigid. Dara was at her side in an instant, along with Bram, both of them staring at the crack as thin black lines began spreading outward from it, like frost creeping across glass. The wind that had been still all evening suddenly picked up, cold and biting, carrying that same smell of rot and old smoke that had marked the very first moment the gate cracked. "It's testing the seal again," Bram said, his voice tight with alarm. "It knows how tired she is. It's using her exhaustion against the wards." "What do I do?" Alira asked, panic sharpening through the fog of her exhaustion. "Hold," Dara said immediately, gripping Alira's shoulder even though she couldn't touch her hands. "Whatever you feel, however hard it pushes, you hold. You have held this long. You can hold a little longer." Alira gritted her teeth and pressed every last scrap of will she had into her palms, imagining herself rooted like a tree, imagining her arms as pillars of stone rather than flesh that could tire and fail. The pressure beneath her hands surged again, harder this time, and she cried out through clenched teeth as the frost crept further along the crack, but slowly, agonizingly, the surge began to fade, retreating back into whatever patient waiting state it had held before. "It's stopping," Bram breathed, watching the frost recede. You held it again." Alira's whole body sagged with relief, though her hands remained fixed to the stone, unable to fully collapse the way the rest of her wanted to. Dara caught her shoulders, holding her upright, murmuring soft reassurances, even as her own voice shook with the aftermath of fear. "You are the strongest person I have ever known," Dara whispered. "Do you hear me? The strongest person I have ever known." Alira didn't have the strength to answer, but she let the words settle into her, holding on to them the way she held onto the stone, because right now, they were the only thing keeping her from breaking apart entirely. Word of the second surge spread through what remained of the watching villagers by morning, and with it came a fresh wave of dread. Bram, exhausted himself, gathered what strength he had left, and sent yet another rider out at first light, this one carrying an even more urgent message toward the capital, begging whoever received it to make certain the king understood exactly how little time might be left. Alira, standing pale and trembling at the gate as the sun rose over the second full day of her ordeal, tried not to think about how much longer she could possibly hold on, or about what would happen to Ashwick Hollow, and to her, if help did not arrive before her strength finally gave out completely. She only knew that somewhere out on the road, if the riders had done their work, an answer was coming. She simply had to survive long enough to meet it. Far to the south, in the capital city of Vayrith, Cade Thornwood stood on the balcony of his war room long before dawn, staring out at a horizon still swallowed in darkness, when the first courier arrived with news from Ashwick Hollow. He had ruled as Alpha King of the United Pax for 6 years, since the day his father died and left him a kingdom, stitched together from a dozen once-warring territories, and in those 6 years, he had learned to trust his instincts above almost anything else. The moment the exhausted courier finished delivering his message, breathless from days of hard riding, Cade felt something in his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with duty. "Say that again," he said quietly, slowly this time. The courier straightened, trying to steady his own nerves in front of the most powerful man in the land. "A gate at the edge of a village called Ashwick Hollow has cracked open, my lord. The elders say it was sealed 100 years ago, over what the old records call the Hollow Curse." A young woman from the village pressed her hands to the stone to stop it from opening further, and now she cannot remove her hands. She has been holding the crack shut since yesterday morning. Cade's advisors, gathered around the long table behind him, exchanged uneasy looks. An older man named Callum, who had served as Cade's chief counselor since before Cade took the throne, leaned forward with a frown creasing his weathered face. "The Hollow Curse," Callum repeated, almost to himself. "I know that name. It's mentioned in the oldest records, from before your father's time, even before his father's. A curse said to have consumed an entire pack a century ago. I believed the seal on it was permanent. Apparently it isn't," Cade said. "And apparently an ordinary girl with no wolf blood is somehow holding it shut with her bare hands, alone, for going on 2 days. That should not be possible, Callum said. A binding of that age and strength should require trained ward keepers, powerful magic, perhaps even royal blood. Not an untrained human woman. And yet, Cade said, she's doing it. He turned away from the balcony and crossed the room in a few long strides, already reaching for the sword that hung near the door, his mind moving faster than his advisors could follow. Something about the story pulled at him in a way he didn't fully understand, an urgency that went beyond simple royal duty. He had responded to dozens of crises over the years, sent soldiers and ward keepers to 100 different disputes and disasters across his territories, but he had never once felt the need to go himself. This time, without knowing exactly why, he knew he had to. "Ready my fastest riders," he said. "We leave within the hour." "My lord," Callum said carefully. "With respect, sending a contingent of ward keepers should be sufficient. There is no need for the king himself to—" "There is every need," Cade said, cutting him off, his voice sharper than he intended. He paused, drawing a slow breath, forcing himself to explain his reasoning, even though part of him wasn't entirely sure of it himself. "If the old wards are failing after 100 years, we need to understand why, and we need to understand what that girl is doing, that our own ward keepers apparently cannot. I want to see this myself." Callum studied him for a long moment, something knowing in his expression, though he said nothing further. He simply nodded and turned to relay the order, and within the hour, Cade rode out from the palace gates at the head of a dozen of his fastest riders, driving them hard along the King's Road toward a village he had never visited, chasing a story he couldn't quite explain his own urgency about. They rode through the day and into the night, stopping only long enough to change horses at relay posts along the way, Cade pushing the pace harder than even his most seasoned riders were accustomed to. He said little during the journey, his mind turning over the courier's words again and again. An ordinary girl, holding back a century-old curse with nothing but her bare hands and her own stubborn will. He tried to imagine what kind of person did such a thing, threw themselves into danger without a second thought, and found he couldn't quite picture it. Not clearly, not until he saw her for himself. They reached the outskirts of Ashwick Hollow late on the second night, the horses lathered and exhausted, the riders barely better off. Word of their approach had traveled ahead of them, and Bram himself came out to meet them at the edge of the village, his old face lined with a desperate kind of relief. "My lord," Bram said, bowing low despite his obvious exhaustion, "you came faster than we dared hope." "Take me to her," Cade said, swinging down from his horse without waiting for further pleasantries. "Now." Bram led him through the quiet, frightened village, past darkened houses where frightened faces peered out from behind curtains, past the small cluster of villagers still keeping vigil near the edge of the woods, until they reached the clearing, where the old gate stood, its ancient stone marred by a long, dark crack that seemed to swallow the moonlight around it. And there, pinned against that stone by forces older than anyone fully understood, stood a young woman who looked nothing like what Cade had imagined. She was smaller than he expected, her frame slight, her dark hair damp with sweat, and clinging to her pale face, despite the cold night air. Frost clung faintly to her fingertips, where her palms pressed flat against the crack, and her whole body trembled with visible exhaustion. Yet somehow she remained upright, her spine straight despite everything, her chin lifted even as her eyes struggled to stay open. There was no wolf strength in her posture, no magic humming beneath her skin that he could sense, just sheer, stubborn will, holding her upright long after her body should have given out. Cade stopped a few paces away, staring at her, and felt something shift inside his chest that he had no name for. "You're the king," Elira said, her voice hoarse and thin, though there was no fear in it, only a kind of tired, disbelieving curiosity. "You actually came." "You expected I wouldn't?" Cade asked. "I expected a lot of things over the last 2 days," Elira said. "Most of them involved dying at this gate before anyone important bothered to show up." Despite everything, despite the gravity of the situation, Cade felt the corner of his mouth twitch, some part of him unexpectedly charmed by her sharp, exhausted honesty. He had met countless nobles and courtiers over the years who would have simpered and flattered him the moment he arrived, desperate for his favor. This girl, half dead on her feet, holding back an ancient curse with her bare hands, had no patience left for anything but the truth. "What's your name?" he asked, moving closer, studying the crack in the stone beneath her palms with a wardkeeper's careful eye, even as his attention kept drifting back to her face. "Elira," she said. "Elira Vance." "Elira," he repeated, testing the name, something settling into place in his chest as he said it, though he couldn't have explained why. "How are you still standing?" "I ask myself that every hour," she admitted, a tired, wry note creeping into her voice, despite everything. "I don't have a good answer for you." Cade crouched down slightly, studying the crack more closely, careful not to touch the stone himself. He could feel the cold radiating from it even at this distance, a wrongness in the air that prickled against his senses, the kind of ancient malice that even a king's instincts recognized as dangerous. Beneath that cold, though, he sensed something else, something threaded through the crack that hadn't been there in any of the old records he'd studied, a presence that felt almost like it was watching him back. "It knows I'm here," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "It's known you were coming for a while," Elira said. "It got worse last night, pushed harder than it had before, like it knew help was on the way and wanted to finish before it arrived." Cade's jaw tightened at that. He turned to Bram, who had followed him into the clearing, along with Dara and a handful of other exhausted villagers. "Tell me everything you know about this curse," he said. "Every record, every fragment, everything your elders passed down. I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before I decide how to close it." "Of course, my lord," Bram said, already turning toward the village to fetch what old texts remained. Cade straightened and looked back at Elira, who was watching him with an expression somewhere between exhaustion and stubborn defiance, as if she expected him to simply order the crack sealed and leave, the way she probably assumed any king would treat an ordinary village girl's suffering as a minor inconvenience to be solved quickly and forgotten. "You've done something none of my ward keepers could have managed," he said instead. "You've held a century-old binding shut with nothing but your own will, for 2 days, without any training, without any magic of your own that I can sense. That is not a small thing, Elira Vance. That is not nothing." Something in her tired eyes flickered at that, surprise breaking briefly through the exhaustion. "Most people just see a girl stuck to a gate," she said quietly. "Then most people aren't looking closely enough," Cade said. He turned to his gathered riders, already issuing orders in a low, commanding voice, sending some to secure the perimeter of the clearing, others to help the village's healers however they could, and one to fetch whatever supplies they had brought that might help ease Elira's suffering, while they worked out how to free her safely. Through it all, though, his attention kept returning to the young woman pinned against the ancient stone, and the strange, unfamiliar ache settling deeper into his chest with every passing minute he spent near her. He had come to Ashwick Hollow expecting to find a crisis he could solve with strength and authority, the way he solved most crises brought before him. Instead, he found himself standing before an exhausted, sharp-tongued village girl who refused to break even when her body had every reason to, and for the first time, in longer than he could remember, Cade Thornwood found himself utterly unprepared for what he was feeling. The night stretched on around them, cold and heavy with the weight of the ancient curse still pulsing beneath Elira's palms, and Cade settled in beside Bram's gathered texts, determined to find a way to end this before it cost the girl everything she had left to give. By the time the first gray light of the third morning touched the treetops above Ashwick Hollow, Cade had not slept, and neither had Elira, though for entirely different reasons. He had spent the night poring over Bram's fragile old texts by lantern light, cross-referencing fragments of legend with the careful observations of his own senses, trying to piece together exactly what kind of force could bind itself to a living person, the way this curse had bound itself to Elira. She, meanwhile, had spent the night simply trying to survive it. "You should rest," Dara told him quietly, sometime near dawn, finding him still hunched over the old records at a makeshift table set up near the clearing. "Even kings need sleep." "I'll rest when I understand what's happening to her," Cade said, without looking up from the brittle page in front of him. "Not before." Dara studied him for a moment, something knowing softening her tired expression. "You've barely known her a night," she said, "and already you speak of her like she matters to you more than the crisis itself." Cade paused at that, his hand stilling against the old page. He hadn't realized how plainly his concern must be showing, hadn't realized how much of himself he'd already revealed simply by refusing to leave Elira's side through the long hours of the night. He didn't answer Dara directly, only returned his attention to the text in front of him, though the truth of her words settled uncomfortably close to something he wasn't ready to examine. By mid-morning, he had gathered his healers around Alira, instructing them carefully on how to tend to her without disturbing her hands on the stone. They worked in careful shifts, cleaning the raw, frost-burned skin around her wrists where it wasn't fused to the gate, feeding her small sips of warm broth, wrapping blankets around her shoulders against the persistent cold radiating from the crack. Cade watched every moment of it, unable to look away, some fierce protective instinct rising in him that he hadn't expected to feel for a stranger. "You don't have to stay and watch all of this," Alira said at one point, her voice raspy with exhaustion, though there was a faint, teasing edge to it despite everything. "I promise I'm not going anywhere. That's precisely why I'm staying," Cade said. "Because you're not going anywhere, and neither am I, until this is resolved." "Must be strange for you," she said. "Sitting in the dirt next to an ordinary village girl, instead of ruling from your palace." "Strange isn't the word I'd choose," Cade said. Alira glanced at him sideways, curiosity flickering through her exhaustion. "What word would you choose?" Cade considered the question longer than he meant to, aware of Dara and several of his own advisors listening nearby, aware that whatever he said next would likely become the subject of quiet speculation among his own people before the day was through. But something about Alira's blunt honesty over the past night had stripped away his usual careful diplomacy, leaving him with less patience for evasive answers than he was accustomed to. "Unexpected," he said finally. "I'd call it unexpected." Alira huffed out something close to a laugh, though it clearly cost her effort. "That's a very careful, kingly answer." "I'm capable of careless ones too," he said, "but I don't think you have the strength left tonight to handle one of those." "Try me," she said, a faint spark of stubborn defiance breaking through her exhaustion. Cade held her gaze for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar tightening in his chest, before he simply shook his head, a reluctant smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Another time, Alira Vance," he said, "when you're not held together by ancient curses and sheer stubbornness." Their exchange was interrupted by one of his advisors calling him over to examine a fresh discovery in the old records, and Cade rose reluctantly, aware of Alira's eyes following him as he crossed the clearing. He forced himself to focus on the text spread before him, on the careful diagrams of old wardwork sketched in fading ink, but part of his attention remained fixed on the young woman behind him, exhausted and trembling yet somehow still fiercely, stubbornly alive. As the day wore on, Cade noticed something troubling in the way Alira's responses had begun to slow, the way her sharp wit occasionally faltered into confused half-sentences before she caught herself and steadied again. Her fever, which had been building steadily since the first night, had begun climbing higher than any of the village healers were comfortable with, and even his own healers, trained in tending to wolves and warriors alike, exchanged worried glances they thought she couldn't see. "She needs more than broth and blankets," one of his healers murmured to him quietly, out of Alira's hearing. "Her body is fighting something far beyond ordinary exhaustion, my lord. Whatever that curse is drawing from her, it's taking more than simple strength. I fear if this continues much longer, her body may fail before the curse ever does." Cade's jaw tightened at that, a cold, unfamiliar fear settling into his chest, sharper and more personal than any threat he had faced in years of ruling. He looked back at Alira, who had drifted into one of her uneasy, half-conscious states, her head tipping forward slightly, before she jerked it back upright with obvious effort, refusing even in her exhaustion to fully surrender to unconsciousness. "There has to be something we can do," he said. "Some way to ease the burden on her, even if we can't remove her from the gate entirely." His healer hesitated. "There is a possibility, my lord, though it isn't without risk. An alpha's strength can sometimes be shared with another through direct contact, a kind of borrowed vitality that could help sustain her while we work out a permanent solution. It isn't something typically done for anyone outside a pack bond, and it isn't without cost to the one sharing it, but it might buy her the time she needs." Cade didn't hesitate for even a moment. "Show me how," he said. His healer's eyebrows rose slightly at the speed of his decision, clearly surprised by how readily their king was willing to offer something so personal, so costly, for a village girl he had known less than a day. But she said nothing further, only nodded, and began explaining the careful process, the kind of contact required, the toll it would take on him in return. Cade listened carefully, memorizing every detail, already moving back toward the gate, before his healer had even finished speaking. determined to do whatever it took to keep Elira standing long enough for them to find a real solution. He crouched beside her, careful not to disturb her bound hands, and gently reached out to rest his palm against the side of her face, tilting her head just enough to meet her half-lidded, exhausted eyes. "Elira," he said quietly, "stay with me. I'm going to help you hold on a little longer." "How?" she murmured, confusion clouding her fevered gaze. "Trust me," he said simply, and then he closed his eyes, focusing every ounce of his alpha strength into the careful, deliberate act of pouring some small measure of his own vitality into her through his touch, the way his healer had described. The effect was immediate. Elira gasped softly as warmth flooded through her exhausted body, chasing back some of the deep, bone-aching cold that had settled into her over the past 2 days. Her eyes sharpened slightly, focus returning to her gaze, even as color slowly crept back into her pale, frost-bitten cheeks. "What did you just do?" she whispered, staring at him with something between confusion and wonder. "Something I've never done for anyone outside my own pack," Cade admitted quietly. "Something my advisors would likely tell me is unwise." "Then why do it?" Elira asked. Cade held her gaze for a long moment, aware of Dara and several of his own people watching the exchange with quiet, careful attention, aware that his answer would carry weight far beyond this single moment. But he found, once again, that he had no interest in careful, diplomatic evasions when it came to Elira Vance. "Because I couldn't watch you fade any further," he said simply, "and do nothing about it." Elira's breath caught softly at that, something shifting in her exhausted expression that had nothing to do with the curse, or the cold, or the ancient stone still gripping her hands. For the first time since the gate had cracked open, hope flickered faintly behind her eyes, small and fragile, but undeniably present. Around them, the whispers among the gathered villagers and Cade's own people grew quieter, more thoughtful, as word of what their king had just done began to settle in. An alpha king, sharing his own strength with an ordinary village girl he had known less than a full day. It was the kind of story that would travel fast, the kind that would already be reshaping itself into rumor and legend by the time the sun set again. Cade paid the whispers no mind. He remained crouched beside Elira, his hand lingering gently against her cheek, a moment longer than strictly necessary, watching the color slowly return to her face, and found that whatever cost this act had demanded of his own strength, he did not regret it in the slightest. Word had spread through the king's own advisors by the time the third day's sun climbed higher over Ashwick Hollow, and Callum, who had ridden through the night to catch up with the rest of the party, arrived just past midday carrying a satchel full of the oldest records the Royal Archive possessed. He found Cade seated near the gate, exhaustion evident in the lines of his face despite his careful composure, and Elira resting more peacefully than she had in 2 days. Color returned to her cheeks, her breathing steadier. "You gave her your strength," Callum said quietly, once he'd drawn Cade aside far enough that Elira couldn't easily overhear. It wasn't a question. "I did," Cade said, offering no further explanation, no apology. Callum studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "That is not a small thing, my lord. Sharing an alpha's vitality outside of pack bonds carries real cost and real risk. Your own healers should be watching you as closely as they're watching her." "I'm aware," Cade said. "I made the choice with clear eyes, Callum. Save your concern." "I would save it," Callum said, "if I believed this was simply about the crisis at hand. But I have known you since before you took the throne, Cade, and I have never once seen you act this way toward a stranger." Cade's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing, watching Elira's sleeping face across the clearing, the frost that had clung so persistently to her fingertips, slowly beginning to fade under the care his healers had given her through the night. "I don't have an explanation for you," he admitted finally. "Only that something about her refuses to leave my thoughts, and I find I have no interest in fighting it." Callum's expression softened slightly, some old weariness giving way to something gentler. "Then perhaps," he said, "we should focus our efforts on making certain she survives long enough for you to explore that feeling properly." Cade managed a tired, grateful smile at that, and the two men turned their attention to the satchel of old records Callum had brought, spreading brittle pages carefully across the makeshift table Bram had set up near the clearing. Together with Bram's own fragments, they began piecing together a fuller picture of the hollow curse, tracing references back through generations of careful, half-forgotten record-keeping. It was Bram, examining one particularly old and water-stained page, who first noticed something that made him go very still. "My lord," he said slowly, "I think you should see this." Cade crossed to his side and studied the page Bram indicated, an old genealogical record listing the founding families of Ashwick Hollow, drawn up sometime shortly after the gate had first been sealed 100 years ago. Near the bottom of the page, faded almost to illegibility, was a name that made Cade's breath catch. Vance. "The family who first sealed the curse," Bram said quietly. "According to this record, it was a woman named Wren Vance who led the original wardkeepers in binding it, 100 years ago. She gave something of herself in the sealing, though the record doesn't specify exactly what. Her descendants remained in the hollow for generations afterward, though the family thinned over the decades, until only a small branch remained." Cade looked up sharply. "Elira's family?" "I believe so, my lord," Bram said, "though if the villagers ever knew the connection, it was long since forgotten. Elira's mother kept to herself, and Elira herself has always been treated somewhat differently by the rest of the hollow, though none of us ever understood exactly why. I suspect now it's because some part of the old wards recognized her family's blood, even if the rest of us never did." Callum leaned over the page, his brow furrowed in thought. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then it would explain why an untrained village girl could bind herself to a century-old curse, the way our own experienced wardkeepers likely couldn't. The gate didn't choose her randomly. It recognized her." "Recognized her how?" Cade asked. "As a threat, or as something else?" "Perhaps as an anchor," Bram said. "The original seal was woven from Wren Vance's own strength. If some thread of that original binding still lingered in the stone after all these years, waiting for a descendant of hers to come close enough, it's possible the curse latched onto Elira not because it wanted to consume her, but because some part of the old wardwork recognized her blood as the key that could renew the binding." Cade turned this over carefully, his mind already working through the implications. "Then the curse isn't simply trying to break free," he said slowly. "It's testing her, waiting to see if she has the strength to finish what her ancestors started 100 years ago." "That would align with everything we've observed," Callum said. "The way it surges when she weakens, testing her resolve. The way it seems to wait, patient, rather than simply overwhelming her outright. If it were purely hostile, it likely would have broken through by now, given how exhausted she's become. Instead, it seems to be waiting for something. For her to choose," Cade said quietly, almost to himself. "Not simply to hold it back by accident, the way she did in that first desperate moment, but to actively choose to finish sealing it, the way her ancestor once did." The three men fell into a heavy silence, the weight of this new understanding settling over them. Across the clearing, Elira stirred from her rest, blinking slowly awake, her eyes finding Cade's almost immediately, some instinct drawing her attention to him even in her exhausted, half-conscious state. Cade rose and crossed back to her side, crouching down carefully, studying her face for any sign of how much of her earlier fever remained. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Better," she admitted, some surprise coloring her tired voice. "Whatever you did last night, it helped. I don't feel like I'm going to collapse anymore, at least not in the next hour." "Good," Cade said, though his expression remained thoughtful, careful. "Elira, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." "That sounds ominous," she said, though a faint, wary smile touched her lips. "Do you know anything about your family?" Cade asked. "Your mother, your grandmother, further back than that? Anything about where your family came from, or what they might have done here in the hollow generations ago?" Elira's brow furrowed, confusion and exhaustion mingling in her expression. "Not much," she admitted slowly. "My mother never spoke of it. She disappeared when I was young, near these very woods, actually. Everyone always said she must have wandered too far and gotten lost, though I never quite believed that. She wasn't the kind of woman who got lost easily." She paused, something flickering behind her tired eyes. "Why are you asking me this?" Cade glanced back at Bram and Callum, both of whom nodded slightly, silently encouraging him to share what they'd discovered. "We found an old record," he said gently. "It seems your family has a much deeper connection to this gate than anyone realized. 100 years ago, a woman named Wren Vance helped seal this very curse. We believe she may have been your ancestor." Alira went very still, staring at him. That's not possible, she said slowly, though her voice lacked real conviction, as if some part of her had already begun to suspect it. I'm nobody. I help mix tonics. I've never done anything remarkable in my life until 2 days ago. And yet, Cade said quietly, here you are, holding closed a binding your own ancestor first wove, in a way none of my experienced wardkeepers could have managed. That is not nothing, Alira. That is not an accident. Alira's eyes drifted toward the crack beneath her hands, something new and complicated moving behind her exhausted expression, a dawning understanding that seemed to settle heavier on her shoulders than even the curse itself had. If that's true, she said slowly, then this was never really about being in the wrong place at the wrong time, was it? This was waiting for me. All this time, long before I was even born. It seems that way, Cade admitted. Alira let out a long, shaky breath, and for the first time since the gate had first cracked open, real fear flickered across her face, deeper and more complicated than simple exhaustion or physical pain. Then what happens now? She asked quietly. If it's waiting for me to finish what she started, what exactly does that mean I have to do? Nobody had a ready answer for her, and the heavy silence that followed carried its own quiet, unsettling weight, as all four of them turned their attention back to the ancient stone, searching for whatever answer might still be waiting, hidden somewhere in the fading ink of a 100-year-old record. By the afternoon of the third day, the sky above Ashwick Hollow had darkened with heavy clouds that seemed to gather specifically over the clearing where the old gate stood, though the rest of the sky remained clear and untouched. Bram called it a bad omen, muttering old sayings under his breath as he worked through his brittle texts. Callum called it a natural consequence of the curse's growing agitation, something in the old wardwork disturbing the air itself. Cade found himself less concerned with naming it, and more concerned with what it meant for how much time they had left. It's reacting to what we've learned, Cade said, watching the dark clouds roll slowly overhead. It knows we understand more now than we did yesterday. Or it senses that Alira understands more, Callum said, which may be worse. Alira, still bound to the gate, had grown quieter since learning about her family's connection to the curse, her sharp wit dimmed by the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. Cade noticed the change immediately and made a point of staying close to her through the afternoon, even as his advisors continued combing through the old records for anything resembling a solution. You've gone quiet, he said, settling beside her. That's unlike you. I'm thinking, she said, about my mother, about whether she knew any of this, about whether she came out here looking for answers, the way I'm being forced to now, and whether that's why she never came back. Cade considered his words carefully before speaking. It's possible, he admitted. But it's also possible she simply wandered too far, the way everyone always assumed. We don't know enough yet to say for certain. I want to know for certain, Alira said, a fierce, determined edge cutting through her exhaustion. If this curse took her the way it tried to take that whole pack a century ago, I want to know. And if there's anything I can do to make sure it never takes anyone else, I want to do it. Even if it costs you everything? Cade asked quietly. Alira met his gaze steadily, despite the exhaustion still etched into every line of her face. I already gave it 2 days, she said. I'm not interested in giving up now. Something in Cade's chest tightened at her words, a fierce, protective pride mixing uncomfortably with a deep, unfamiliar fear for her safety. He said nothing further, only reached out and gently squeezed her shoulder, a small gesture of solidarity that Alira seemed to draw quiet strength from despite its simplicity. As the afternoon wore into evening, Bram uncovered a fragment of text tucked into the back of one of the oldest records, written in a hand different from the rest of the document, hurried and uneven, as if scrawled in haste by someone under great strain. He read it over twice before calling the others to his side, his voice trembling slightly with a mixture of excitement and dread. Listen to this, he said. It's a note, apparently written by Wren Vance herself, tucked into the record after the original sealing. She writes that the binding she wove was never meant to last forever. She writes that a curse of this nature cannot simply be locked away and forgotten, that it must eventually be answered, not merely contained. She writes that she chose to give a piece of her own strength to buy her descendants time, generations of time, but that eventually, someone of her bloodline would need to finish what she began, by choosing, freely, to answer the curse's hunger, rather than simply holding it back. Answer its hunger how? Cade asked. Bram continued reading, his voice growing quieter. She writes that the curse does not hunger for blood, or for destruction, the way the old village stories always assumed. It hungers for a choice. A binding of will, freely given, not forced. She believes that is the only way to end it permanently, rather than simply sealing it away for another 100 years, to be someone else's burden in the future. Elira absorbed this in silence, her exhausted expression turning thoughtful, careful. So all of this, she said slowly, everything I've done these past 3 days, holding the crack shut without even understanding why I could do it at all. That wasn't the answer it wanted. That was just me buying time, the way she once did. It would seem so, Bram said gently. And now it wants me to choose, Elira said, to actually decide, with full understanding of what I'm doing, to bind myself to it permanently, the way she apparently intended someone eventually would. We don't know for certain that's what's required, Cade said quickly, an edge of protective urgency entering his voice. This is one interpretation of an old, incomplete text. We shouldn't assume it demands sacrifice on your part without exploring every other possibility first. What other possibilities are there? Elira asked, turning to look at him directly. You've spent all day searching, and this is the closest thing to an answer we've found. If it's true, then I need to decide what I'm willing to do about it, and I'd rather decide with clear eyes than wait until I'm too exhausted to think straight. Cade wanted to argue further, wanted to insist there had to be another way, some path forward that didn't require Elira giving anything more of herself than she already had. But looking at her steady, determined expression, despite everything her body had already endured, he found he couldn't deny the quiet courage in her decision to face this honestly, rather than hide from it. Then let us understand fully what such a choice would require, he said instead. Before you make any decision at all, I won't have you binding yourself to something without knowing exactly what it will cost you. They spent the remainder of the evening poring over every fragment of text Bram and Callum could find, piecing together, as full a picture as possible, of what Ren Vance's original binding had entailed, and what a permanent answer to the curse's hunger might require of Elira now. The picture that slowly emerged was unsettling, but not without hope. The curse, it seemed, was not a purely destructive force, but something closer to an old wound, left unhealed, a grief so deep it had calcified into something monstrous over the passing century. To answer it properly meant offering it not blood or sacrifice in the way the old village stories feared, but a binding of shared will, strong enough to finally let that old grief settle and fade, rather than fester and hunger indefinitely. It needs strength, Callum said finally, studying the assembled fragments with a thoughtful frown. Not simply Elira's strength alone, which is already stretched thin after 3 days at that gate, but enough combined strength to finally exhaust whatever remains of the curse's hunger for good, rather than simply holding it in check for another century. Cade looked at Elira, then at his own hands, understanding dawning slowly in his expression. Combined strength, he repeated quietly. Mine and hers together. It would be dangerous, Callum warned. Neither of you fully understands the cost such a binding might demand. It could drain you both far more severely than the vitality sharing you already attempted last night. I'm aware of the risk, Cade said, but if it's the only way to end this properly, rather than leaving another burden for some future generation to inherit, then I intend to see it through. Elira studied him carefully, something warm and complicated moving behind her tired eyes. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. This was never your burden to carry. It's mine, inherited from a family I never even knew I belonged to. It became my burden the moment I saw you standing at this gate, Cade said simply. I'm not interested in letting you carry it alone, Elira Vance, whether you inherited it or not. Something in Elira's exhausted expression softened at that, gratitude, and something deeper, something she didn't yet have words for, passing quietly between them in the fading evening light. Around them, the dark clouds continued to gather overhead, and beneath Elira's palms, the crack in the ancient stone seemed to pulse with renewed, patient anticipation, as if it, too, sensed that the choice it had been waiting for was finally drawing near. Night settled fully over Ashwick Hollow, thick and heavy beneath the gathering clouds, and Elira found herself drifting in and out of uneasy half-sleep as exhaustion pulled at her, despite the renewed strength Cade's earlier gift had given her. In those fragile, drifting moments, Memories she hadn't thought about in years began surfacing unbidden, fragments of her childhood she had never fully understood until now. She remembered her mother, a quiet, watchful woman named Ivy, who had always kept a careful distance from the rest of the village, never quite fitting into the easy familiarity most of Ashwick Hollow's residents shared with one another. She remembered evenings spent watching her mother stare out toward the edge of the woods with an expression Alira had never been able to name as a child, something between longing and dread. She remembered, too, the day her mother had walked out toward those same woods and never returned, the search parties that combed the trees for weeks afterward, the quiet, resigned grief that had settled over their small household in the years that followed. I think she knew, Alira murmured, half to herself, half to Cade, who had stayed close beside her through the night, despite his own obvious exhaustion. About the curse, about our family. I think that's why she used to stare at the woods like that. She was waiting for something, the way I've been waiting these past 3 days, without understanding what for. What do you think happened to her? Cade asked, gently. I think she came here, Alira said slowly, working through the realization, even as she spoke it aloud. I think she felt the pull of it, the way I did, and came to face it alone, without understanding what it truly required of her. She paused, her throat tightening with old, unresolved grief. I think the curse might have taken her the way it swallowed that whole pack a century ago, because she didn't understand what Ren Vance's note explained, that it wasn't blood it wanted, but a choice freely given, an answer rather than a sacrifice. Cade said nothing for a long moment, simply resting his hand gently over hers where it lay pinned against the stone, offering silent comfort in place of empty reassurances he couldn't honestly give. If that's true, he said finally, then perhaps part of what we're doing here isn't only about ending the curse. Perhaps it's also about finally giving your mother the answer she never got the chance to give. Alira's eyes stung with unexpected tears, exhaustion and grief, and something fragile and hopeful all tangling together in her chest. I'd like that, she whispered. I'd like to believe she didn't simply vanish into nothing, that there was meaning in what happened to her, even if it took me this long to understand it. They sat together in silence for a while after that, the weight of old grief and new understanding settling comfortably between them, until Bram approached quietly, careful not to disturb the moment more than necessary, carrying with him one final fragment of text he had discovered tucked deep within the oldest record they possessed. My lord, he said gently, Alira, I think you should see this before we go further. He read the fragment aloud, his voice soft in the heavy night air. It was a final line from Ren Vance's own hurried note, one they had somehow missed in their earlier reading, a small addendum scrawled almost as an afterthought at the very bottom of the page. It read simply that the one who finally answered the curse's hunger would not do so alone, that the old ward work required not merely strength, but connection, a bond formed freely between the one anchoring the binding and another willing to share the burden alongside them, whether that bond be forged through blood, through friendship, or through something the old record simply called a joining of hearts. Alira read the words slowly, then looked up at Cade, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet dark. A joining of hearts, she repeated softly. It would seem the curse requires more than shared strength alone, Bram said. It requires a bond strong enough to hold that strength together, freely given, without hesitation or resentment on either side. Cade held Alira's gaze steadily, something fierce and certain settling into his expression, despite the uncertainty of everything else around them. Then it's fortunate, he said quietly, that I have no hesitation left in me at all. Alira's breath caught softly at the quiet conviction in his voice, warmth spreading through her chest, despite the cold radiating from the gate beneath her palms. 3 days ago, she said, a faint, disbelieving smile touching her exhausted face. I was an ordinary girl mixing tonics, and you were a king I'd never even met. Now you're telling me our hearts need to join together to end a 100-year-old curse. Strange as it sounds, Cade said, I find I'm not opposed to the idea. Neither am I, Alira admitted quietly, though I'd have preferred a less dramatic introduction. A tired, genuine laugh escaped her despite everything, and Cade felt something in his chest loosen at the sound of it, grateful beyond words that exhaustion and grief hadn't fully extinguished the sharp, stubborn spirit that had drawn him to her from the very first moment he'd seen her standing at this gate. The remainder of the night passed in careful preparation, Callum and Bram working together to understand exactly what the joining Ren Vance's note described might require, cross-referencing what little remained of the old wardwork traditions, with careful, cautious logic. By the time the first pale light of dawn began creeping over the horizon, marking the beginning of Alira's third full day bound to the gate, they had assembled as complete an understanding as they could manage. It will require both of you to hold contact with the stone, and with each other simultaneously, Callum explained, his voice grave with the weight of what he was about to ask of them. Cade will need to pour not merely his physical strength into the binding, the way he did last night, but something deeper, a genuine commitment of will, freely given, matching whatever Alira offers in turn. The old record suggests this joining, once made, cannot easily be undone. It will bind the two of you together in ways beyond simply ending the curse. I understand, Cade said without hesitation. Elira, Callum said gently, turning to her, you should understand as well, before we proceed, exactly what you may be agreeing to. This is not a burden that ends when the curse does. If the old texts are accurate, whatever bond forms between you and the king today may last considerably longer than that. Elira looked toward Cade, exhausted but steady, weighing the weight of Callum's warning against everything she had already come to feel over these long, harrowing 3 days. I've spent 3 days holding this curse shut without fully understanding why, she said finally. I'd rather finish it properly, and accept whatever comes with that, than spend another 100 years, leaving this burden for someone else in my family to inherit, the way my mother once might have wished she could. She turned back to Cade, something quiet and certain settling into her exhausted expression. I'm ready, she said. Whatever this joining requires, I'm ready to give it. Cade held her gaze for a long, steady moment, something deep and unshakable settling into his own chest in answer. Then let's finish this, he said quietly. Together. Behind them, the eastern sky continued brightening with the approach of full dawn, and beneath Alira's palms, the ancient crack in the stone pulsed once, sharp and expectant, as if it, too, understood that the moment it had waited 100 years for, was finally, at last, arriving. The clearing grew unnervingly quiet as the sun rose fully over Ashwick Hollow, the gathered villagers, Bram, Dara, and Cade's own advisors, falling silent, as Cade knelt beside Alira at the base of the ancient gate, preparing for what all of them understood might be the final, decisive moment of this ordeal. The heavy clouds that had gathered the day before still hung low over the clearing, dark and waiting, as if the sky itself understood the significance of what was about to unfold. Are you certain about this? Cade asked one last time, his voice low and steady despite the tension coiled tightly beneath it. I've never been more certain of anything, Alira said, and despite the exhaustion still etched deeply into her face, there was no hesitation in her voice at all. Cade nodded once and moved closer, positioning himself directly behind her, so that his chest pressed lightly against her back, careful not to disturb her bound hands on the stone. He reached around her carefully, resting his own palms gently over the backs of her hands, matching his skin to hers against the cold, ancient surface of the gate. The moment contact was made, the crack beneath their combined hands surged with sudden, violent cold, sharper and more forceful than anything Alira had felt in the previous 3 days. She gasped, her whole body tensing, but Cade's steady presence at her back kept her grounded, his voice low and calm against her ear. Stay with me, he said. Whatever happens, stay with me. I'm here, she managed, through gritted teeth, though the pulling sensation beneath her palms had sharpened into something almost unbearable. Deep tendrils of cold, reaching up through the stone and wrapping around her wrists, her arms, drawing hungrily at whatever strength remained in her exhausted body. Cade felt it too, the curse's ancient hunger reaching beyond Alira now, testing his own strength, searching for weakness in the bond forming between them. He pushed back against it deliberately, pouring not just his physical vitality into the connection the way he had the night before, but something deeper, more personal, an unguarded offering of genuine commitment that he had never once extended to anyone outside his own small circle of trusted advisors. I choose this, he said aloud, his voice carrying clearly across the silent clearing, freely and without hesitation. Whatever this curse demands of me, I offer it willingly, to end what has haunted this place for 100 years. Beside him, Elira felt the weight of his words, settling into the binding, forming between them, and she drew a steadying breath, gathering her own remaining strength for what she understood needed to come next. "I choose this too," she said, her voice hoarse but resolute. "Not out of obligation to a family I never fully knew, and not simply because the curse latched onto me by chance 3 days ago. I choose to finish what my ancestor began, freely, and I choose to share this burden with him, freely, because I trust him with it." The moment her words left her lips, the crack beneath their joined hands let out a sound unlike anything either of them had heard before. A low, mournful groan that seemed to come from somewhere impossibly deep within the stone itself, ancient and grief-stricken rather than simply hostile. The cold radiating from the gate intensified sharply, and for one terrifying moment, Elira felt as though the ground itself might give way beneath her, the pull of the curse's ancient hunger reaching a fever pitch as it drew every last reserve of strength from both her and Cade at once. "Hold," Cade said through gritted teeth, his own voice strained with visible effort. "Elira, hold with me. Just a little longer." "I'm holding," she gasped, though her vision had begun to blur at the edges, exhaustion, and the curse's relentless pull threatening to drag her down into darkness despite everything. Behind them, Bram and Callum watched with pale, tense faces as the dark clouds overhead began to churn violently, thunder rolling somewhere in the distance, despite the absence of any storm the day before. Dara gripped Bram's arm tightly, both of them frozen in place, unable to do anything but watch, as the two figures at the gate strained against a force older and hungrier than anything either of them had ever witnessed. "It's fighting the joining," Callum said, his voice tight with alarm. "It doesn't want to be released. It's been alone with its grief for a century, and some part of it fears letting go of that pain, more than it fears being consumed by it." "Then we give it a reason to let go," Cade growled, and he tightened his hold over Elira's hands, drawing on every last reserve of strength his body possessed, pouring it into the binding without reservation, without holding anything back. Elira felt his strength flooding into her, mingling with her own exhausted will, and she matched it with everything she had left, not simply holding the crack shut the way she had for the past 3 days, but actively reaching into the ancient grief pulsing beneath her palms and offering it something it had never received in 100 years of solitary confinement: acknowledgement, understanding, the simple, quiet truth that its pain had been seen and that it no longer needed to hold on to it alone. "I see you," she whispered, her voice breaking with the effort of the words, tears slipping unnoticed down her exhausted face. "Whatever you lost, whatever grief turned you into this, I see it. You don't have to hold on to it anymore. Let it go." For a long, suspended moment, nothing happened at all. The cold and the pulling sensation, and the mournful groaning sound, all hanging suspended in the tense morning air, as if the ancient curse itself were considering her words. Then, slowly, impossibly, the pulling sensation beneath Elira's palms began to ease, the cold retreating, inch by inch, back into the stone, the dark clouds overhead beginning to thin, as the first true rays of full sunlight broke through toward the clearing below. "It's working," Bram breathed, disbelief evident in his voice. "Sweet mercy, it's actually working." Elira felt the ancient grief pulsing beneath her hands finally begin to settle, like a held breath finally releasing after 100 years of tension, and slowly, carefully, she felt her fingers regain the smallest measure of freedom, no longer fused rigidly to the stone, but resting against it now by choice rather than compulsion. "Cade," she whispered, wonder and exhaustion mingling in her voice, "I think we're actually doing it." "I know," he said, his own voice thick with relief and effort. "Just a little further, Elira. We're almost there." Together, they pushed through the final, fading resistance of the curse's ancient hunger, offering it everything they had left, until at last, with one final, shuddering exhale that seemed to ripple through the very foundations of the old gate, the crack beneath their joined hands finally, fully stilled. The cold vanished entirely, replaced by ordinary morning air, warm with the returning sunlight now breaking freely through the last of the dispersing clouds. Elira slumped forward, her strength finally spent, but Cade caught her instantly, gathering her carefully against his chest, his own body trembling with exhaustion, but his hold on her utterly steady and sure. "Is it over?" Elira whispered, her eyes fluttering with the weight of true, complete exhaustion, finally catching up to her after 3 impossible days. Cade looked at the gate, at the crack that had finally, truly, sealed itself closed, the ancient stone settling into ordinary, harmless silence for the first time in 100 years. "Yes," he said softly, holding her close against him. "It's over, Alira. You did it. We did it." Around them, the gathered villagers erupted into disbelieving, relieved cheers, and Bram sank to his knees at the edge of the clearing, murmuring quiet thanks to whatever old gods still listened. But Cade paid the celebration little mind, his entire focus fixed on the exhausted young woman in his arms, finally free from the curse that had held her captive for 3 unbearable days, safe now, and breathing steadily against his chest. Alira woke slowly, warmth wrapping around her body in a way that felt entirely unfamiliar after 3 days of bone-deep cold. For a long moment, she simply lay still, listening to the quiet crackle of a nearby fire and the soft murmur of voices somewhere beyond the room she found herself in, trying to piece together where exactly she was and how she had gotten there. The last clear memory she held was of Cade's arms catching her as her strength finally gave out, the curse's ancient grief settling into silence beneath their joined hands, the warm sunlight breaking through scattering clouds overhead. Everything after that had blurred into fragments, brief flashes of being carried, of Dara's worried voice checking her pulse, of a long, jostling journey she only half remembered. She opened her eyes fully and found herself in an unfamiliar room, richly furnished in a way that immediately told her she was no longer in Ashwick Hollow. Soft light filtered through tall windows, and the bed beneath her was softer than anything she had ever slept on in her life. Her hands, she noticed with a rush of relief, lay free at her sides, no longer bound to any cursed stone. The skin along her palms and wrists healed cleanly, without so much as a scar to mark what she had endured. A soft knock sounded at the door, and Dara's familiar face appeared, relief washing over her expression the moment she saw Alira awake and alert. "You're finally awake," Dara said, hurrying to her bedside. "You've been sleeping for 2 full days. We were beginning to worry." 2 days? Alira repeated, struggling to sit up, though Dara gently pressed her back down against the pillows. "Rest," Dara said firmly. "You earned it, more than anyone I've ever known. You're in the capital now, Alira. The king insisted you be brought here, to be properly cared for by his own healers." Alira absorbed this slowly, memories of the past several days settling more clearly into place now that her mind had cleared. "The curse," she said. "Is it truly gone?" "Completely," Dara confirmed, warmth and wonder mingling in her voice. "The village has never felt so peaceful. Whatever grief that old curse carried, you and the king together finally laid it to rest. Ashwick Hollow owes you both a debt it can never fully repay." Alira let out a slow, relieved breath, some deep tension she hadn't even realized she was still carrying, finally easing from her shoulders. "And Cade?" she asked, unable to keep a note of hesitant hope from creeping into her voice. "Is he well?" Dara's expression softened into something knowing, a faint, teasing smile touching her lips. "He is well," she said, "though I don't believe he's left this palace more than a few hours at a time since we arrived. He's been asking after you constantly. I dare say you'll see for yourself soon enough." As if summoned by the very mention of his name, a soft knock sounded at the door once more, and Cade himself stepped inside, pausing the moment he saw Alira awake and sitting up in bed. Something in his expression shifted immediately, relief and warmth breaking across his usually composed features in a way that made Alira's heart stumble unexpectedly in her chest. "You're awake," he said, crossing the room quickly to her bedside, Dara stepping back discreetly to give them space. "So I've been told," Alira said, a tired but genuine smile tugging at her lips. 2 days, apparently. I hope I didn't miss anything important." "Only the entire kingdom celebrating the end of a 100-year-old curse," Cade said, settling into the chair beside her bed, his gaze never leaving her face, as if he still couldn't quite believe she was truly awake and well in front of him. "Though I'll admit, none of the celebrations felt complete without you conscious to witness them." Alira studied him for a long moment, noting the faint shadows still lingering beneath his eyes, evidence of his own exhaustion from the ordeal they had shared. "You look tired," she said. "I've had a great deal on my mind," Cade admitted, "mostly concerning your recovery." "Only my recovery?" Alira asked, a faint, teasing note creeping into her voice despite her lingering exhaustion. Cade's mouth curved into a small, genuine smile, something unguarded in his expression that Alira suspected very few people outside his closest advisors ever got to witness. Perhaps not only that, he admitted. I find I've had considerable difficulty thinking of much else besides you, Alira Vance, since the moment I first found you standing at that gate. Warmth spread through Alira's chest at his words, chasing away the last lingering traces of exhaustion and uncertainty that had clung to her since waking. That's a very careful, kingly admission, she said, echoing words he had once used with her back in the hollow. I told you once, Cade said, his voice softening further, that I was capable of careless answers too. I believe you're finally strong enough now to hear one. Then let's hear it, Alira said, holding his gaze steadily, despite the quickening of her own heartbeat. Cade reached out and gently took her hand in his, the same hand that had once been bound helplessly to ancient cursed stone, now resting freely and willingly in his own. I have ruled 6 years as Alpha King, he said quietly, and in all that time, I have never once felt the way I felt, watching you hold that gate shut, refusing to break, no matter what it cost you. I don't fully understand everything this joining between us means. Not yet, not completely. But I know I have no interest in letting it fade now that the curse is gone. I want to understand it fully, Alira, with you, for as long as you'll allow me to. Alira's breath caught, emotion rising thick and warm in her throat, as she absorbed the quiet sincerity in his words. 3 days ago, she said softly, I was simply a village girl who mixed tonics and lived a quiet, unremarkable life. I never imagined any of this, Cade. Not the curse, not you, not any of it. Do you regret it? He asked, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through his composure for the first time since she'd woken. No, Alira said immediately, firmly, surprising even herself with the certainty in her own voice. I don't regret a single moment of it, even the parts that hurt. Especially not the parts that led me here, to you. Something in Cade's expression eased entirely at that, relief and quiet joy settling into his features as he lifted her hand gently to his lips, pressing a soft, reverent kiss against her healed knuckles. Then let us discover together, he said quietly, whatever comes next. Outside the tall windows of the room, the capital of Vayrith stretched out beneath a clear, sunlit sky, entirely unaware of the quiet, world-altering moment unfolding within the palace walls. Alira, still weak from her ordeal, but stronger in spirit than she had ever imagined herself capable of being, found herself smiling at the unexpected, remarkable turn her simple, ordinary life had taken, grateful beyond words for the courage that had carried her through those 3 impossible days, and for the unexpected bond that had formed in their wake. Weeks passed before Alira fully regained her strength, the palace healers marveling at how thoroughly the curse had drained her, and how remarkably, steadily, she recovered under their careful attention. Throughout those weeks, Cade remained a constant presence in her life, setting aside as much of his royal duties as he reasonably could to sit with her through her recovery, sharing meals and quiet conversation, as the strange, sudden bond between them steadily deepened into something neither of them could deny any longer. Word of what had happened at Ashwick Hollow had traveled far beyond the small village by then, growing into something close to legend across the territories of the United Pax. Villagers who had never given the Hollow a second thought now spoke in hushed, admiring tones of the ordinary girl who had held a century-old curse shut with her bare hands, and of the Alpha King who had ridden to her side and stayed until the very end. Alira found the attention uncomfortable at first, unused to being spoken of as anything remarkable, but slowly, with Cade's steady support, she began to accept that perhaps she had indeed done something worth remembering. Bram and Dara returned to Ashwick Hollow once Alira's recovery was well underway, carrying with them the king's formal gratitude and a promise of continued protection and support for the village that had waited so anxiously through those 3 harrowing days. Before they left, Dara had pulled Alira into a fierce, tearful embrace, holding her tightly for a long moment. You saved us all, Dara said. Never forget that, whatever else happens next. I couldn't have done it without you, Alira said, returning the embrace just as fiercely. You never left my side, not once, not even when it would have been easier to. That's what family does, Dara said simply, and Alira understood, in that moment, that whatever blood connection she may have inherited from Ren Vance, the truest family she possessed, had always been the people who chose to stand beside her, curse or no curse. As the weeks stretched into a full season, Elira found herself settling gradually into an unexpected new life within the palace walls, still uncertain at times about where exactly she belonged in this grand, unfamiliar world of politics and pack hierarchies, but steadied always by Cade's unwavering presence beside her. Their bond, forged in crisis and confirmed through quiet, careful conversations in the months that followed, deepened into something neither of them had words fully adequate to describe, though neither felt any need to rush toward defining it either. It was on a clear autumn evening, nearly 6 months after the curse had finally been laid to rest, that Cade called together his full court, along with representatives from Ashwick Hollow, including Bram and Dara, to make a formal announcement that many had quietly anticipated for some time. Elira stood beside him at the front of the great hall, her heart steady despite the weight of so many eyes upon her, wearing the quiet confidence she had earned through 3 impossible days at an ancient, cursed gate. 6 months ago, Cade began, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed hall, I received word of a crisis at the edge of my kingdom, a curse, 100 years sealed, cracking open, with no clear solution in sight. I rode to Ashwick Hollow expecting to find a crisis I could solve with strength and authority, the way I have solved every crisis brought before me these past 6 years. He paused, his gaze finding Elira's, warmth and quiet certainty filling his expression. Instead, I found someone whose courage and strength put my own to shame, an ordinary woman who held back an ancient hunger with nothing but her bare hands and her own unbreakable will, and who taught me, in the process, exactly what true strength actually looks like. A murmur of quiet approval rippled through the gathered court, and Elira felt her cheeks warm under the weight of so much sincere attention, though she held her chin steady, refusing to shrink from it the way old habits might once have urged her to. I do not stand before you today, Cade continued, simply to honor Elira Vance for what she accomplished at that gate, though that honor is more than deserved. I stand before you to acknowledge what has grown between us since that day, a bond neither of us anticipated, but one I have no interest in denying any longer. He turned fully toward Elira, taking both her hands in his expression open and unguarded, before the entire assembled court. Elira, you did not simply hold a curse shut for 3 impossible days. You held my heart steady, in ways I didn't know it needed holding, from the very first moment I saw you standing at that gate, refusing to break. I would be honored, more than any title or crown could ever express, if you would remain by my side, not merely as the woman who saved my kingdom, but as the woman I intend to spend the rest of my life beside. Elira's breath caught, emotion rising thick and warm in her chest, as she looked out at the assembled court, at Bram and Dara watching with tearful, proud smiles, at Callum nodding approvingly from his place near the throne, and finally back to Cade's steady, hopeful gaze. 3 days ago, she said softly, echoing words she had spoken to him once before, though now with an entirely different weight behind them. Or rather, 6 months ago now, I was simply a village girl who mixed tonics and lived a quiet life I thought would never change. I never imagined any of this. Not the curse, not the crown, and certainly not you. She squeezed his hands gently, her own smile breaking free at last, warm and certain. But I don't regret a single moment of the path that led me here. I would be honored to remain by your side, Cade Thornwood, for however long you'll have me. The great hall erupted into warm, genuine celebration, and Cade drew Elira gently into his arms, holding her close before the entire assembled court. Relief and joy and quiet, unshakable devotion, written plainly across both their faces. Outside the tall windows of the palace, the autumn evening settled peacefully over the capital of Vayrith, calm and undisturbed. The ancient curse that had once threatened to consume everything finally, truly laid to rest. In the months and years that followed, the story of Ashwick Hollow's gate became something of a legend across the territories of the United Packs, told and retold in countless variations, though the core of it always remained the same. An ordinary girl, faced with an impossible crisis, had refused to run, had held on through 3 unbearable days with nothing but her own stubborn will, and had ultimately found not only the strength to end a century-old curse, but an unexpected love that would carry her far beyond the quiet, simple life she had once imagined for herself. Elira Vance never forgot the cold ache of those 3 days, bound to ancient stone, nor the exhaustion that had nearly broken her long before help arrived. But she remembered, too, the moment Cade Thornwood had found her there, unwilling to look away, and the quiet, unshakable strength they had discovered together in the days and months that followed. Whatever challenges still lay ahead for the two of them, ruling a kingdom stitched together from a dozen once warring territories, she faced them now not as an ordinary village girl thrust suddenly into extraordinary circumstances, but as a woman who had already proven, through 3 of the hardest days of her life, exactly what she was capable of enduring, and exactly what she was capable of becoming on the other side of it.